Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about 17 days. Not 17 years, not 17 months, 17 days. That is the distance, the entire distance, between the moment a Queen of England lost her head on a scaffold inside the Tower of London and the moment the king who put her there slid a ring onto another woman's finger. 17 days. Now, before we go any further, I want to address the word in the title, because some of you clicked that and thought, wait, wasn't this a legal execution? And technically, yes, there was a trial, there was a verdict, there was a warrant signed with the full weight of the English crown behind it. Every box was ticked, every form was filled out, every legal courtesy was extended. But here is the question the title is actually asking, and it is a moral question, not a legal one. If a king decides he wants to be rid of his wife, and then constructs the charges, selects the jury, controls the outcome, and is engaged to someone new the very morning the blade falls, at what point does execution become just a more formal word for something else? I am not going to answer that tonight. Not yet. What I am going to do is lay the calendar in front of you, date by date, and let you answer it yourself. But first, I need you to hold on to 3 things as we go through this story. 3 details. Plant them somewhere in your mind and keep them there, because I am going to come back to each one, and when I do, each one is going to hit harder than it did the first time. The first is those 17 days. The second is a little girl, 2 years old, sitting in a nursery at Hatfield, not yet understanding that the woman she would spend her entire life almost never speaking of had just gone quiet forever. And the third, the one that makes this whole story something more than a tragedy, is this. Anne Boleyn was not destroyed despite her power. She was destroyed because of it. And the difference between those 2 things is the entire story. Or if this kind of history, the kind they left out of the textbooks, is what you're here for, hit subscribe right now. We go deep here. Every single time. Here is what most people get wrong about Anne Boleyn. They picture her as a victim, a woman swept up in events too large for her, caught between a king's desire and his cruelty, helpless, passive, waiting. And that picture, that soft, sad picture, is almost insultingly wrong. Anne Boleyn was one of the shrewdest political operators of the 16th century. Full stop, not for a woman, not given the limitations of her era. Full stop. She had been educated in the French court, in the household of Queen Claude, where she absorbed not only the language but the architecture of power, how it moved, where it lived, what it cost, and how to hold it without letting it consume you. She returned to England around 1521 with an education that most English noblewomen never received and a mind sharp enough to use every piece of it. When Henry VIII first turned his attention toward her, she did something that would strike any reasonable person as either extraordinary courage or extraordinary calculation. Probably both. She said no, not to his face, in a blazing confrontation. More quietly than that, she simply declined to become what her sister Mary had already been, a royal mistress, used and retired with a modest pension, and the permanent understanding that the transaction was complete. Anne watched what happened to women who gave a king what he wanted immediately. She understood the economics of scarcity, and so she waited. For 6 years, Henry VIII wrote her letters, love letters, and not casual ones. The 17 surviving letters he wrote to her are among the most remarkable documents of his reign, full of longing and frustration and the very specific suffering of a man not accustomed to being made to wait for anything. In one of them, He signs himself your loyal and most insured servant, a king of England, signing himself as her servant. That is how much power Anne Boleyn had, before she had any official power at all. But here is where the story gets bigger than a love affair. Henry wanted Anne. Anne would not become his mistress. And Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon, Catherine the deeply devout, Catherine the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Catherine who had been married to Henry for over 20 years and who was not going to quietly agree to a divorce because her husband had developed an inconvenient passion for a dark-eyed English girl. A different man might have simply given up, or found a quieter arrangement. Henry VIII broke his country's entire relationship with Rome instead. The Church of England, the institution that reshaped the religious and political landscape of an entire nation, was, among other things, the legal machinery Henry needed to dissolve a marriage that the Pope refused to dissolve. And while historians rightly point out that Henry had genuine theological grievances and genuine political motives that went beyond one woman, the specific urgent timing of that break is inseparable from Anne Boleyn. She did not cause the English Reformation single-handedly, but she was the fire under it. In 1533, Henry secretly married her. In June of that year, she was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony of breathtaking magnificence at Westminster Abbey. In September of that year, she gave birth to a daughter. The daughter's name was Elizabeth. Remember that. Here's the thing about power that nobody warned you about in advance. It does not erode slowly. It does not give you a long, graceful decline with time to prepare. It gives you no warning at all, and then one morning you wake up and the ground has already shifted 6 inches beneath you, and by the time you feel it, the shift is complete. For Anne Boleyn, that morning came sometime in early 1536, and to understand why 1536 specifically, you have to understand something that sounds counterintuitive at first. That for all the years Anne had spent fighting Catherine of Aragon for the king's attention, Catherine's continued existence had actually been protecting her. Because while Catherine lived, while the humiliated first queen remained alive, still insisting she was the rightful queen, still commanding the loyalty of the Holy Roman Emperor who was her nephew, still representing an ongoing political and theological problem for Henry, Anne was, in a very practical sense, necessary. She was the choice Henry had made, the choice that had cost him his standing with Rome, his relationship with Spain, the love of half his own people who thought he had treated Catherine shamefully. He could not afford to back away from that choice while Catherine was alive to make backing away look like an admission. On January 7, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle, and without meaning to, without a single word, Catherine took something with her when she went. She took Anne's argument for why Henry needed to keep her. Henry VIII reportedly celebrated when he heard the news. He dressed in yellow, which was either a festive color in Tudor England or a deliberate insult to the woman he had spent years in public battle with, depending on which historian you ask. He held celebrations at court. He carried his daughter Elizabeth into the Great Hall that evening and showed her off to the assembled courtiers. That daughter, that 2-year-old girl. Do you remember what I asked you to hold on to? On January 24, 1536, Henry VIII was thrown from his horse during a jousting tournament at Greenwich. He was wearing full armor. He fell heavily. He was reportedly unconscious for 2 hours. 2 hours during which, by some accounts, everyone present believed the King of England was dead. Anne was approximately 3 to 4 months pregnant with what everyone was hoping would be a son. What happened next is documented and not disputed. Sometime around January 29th, 1536, Anne Boleyn miscarried. The nature of that miscarriage has been the subject of enormous historical argument, mostly because the only detailed description of it comes from Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador to England, who despised Anne, referred to her in his dispatches as the concubine, and had every political motive in the world to describe her pregnancy in the most damning terms possible. His account claimed the fetus was deformed, malformed in ways that, in 16th century thinking, could be read as a sign of supernatural corruption. Historians today treat Chapuis' description with considerable skepticism. What is not disputed is that Anne lost a male child. In the 16th century, a queen's first and most critical political function was to produce a male heir. Anne had been queen for nearly 3 years. She had produced one daughter. She had now lost what appeared to be a son. Catherine of Aragon's ghost was barely cold, and Anne had already lost the argument she most needed to win. Henry came to see her after the miscarriage. According to one account, he stood at her bedside and said, with a coldness that reportedly stunned the room, that he could see God would not give them male children. Anne, who was still recovering, who had just lost a child, looked at him and reportedly said that she had miscarried because of the distress she had suffered over his jousting accident, that the shock of being told he might be dying had caused it. Henry said nothing useful in return. He left. And somewhere in the silence of that room, in the space between what Anne said and what Henry refused to acknowledge, the remaining months of her life began their quiet countdown. This is the part where I need to introduce you to Thomas Cromwell, because you cannot understand what happened to Anne Boleyn in the spring of 1536 without understanding Thomas Cromwell, and you cannot understand Thomas Cromwell without setting aside everything you might think you know about how Tudor politics worked. Cromwell was not a nobleman. He was the son of a blacksmith from Putney. He had clawed his way up through law, through trade, through the service of Cardinal Wolsey, and then, when Wolsey fell from Henry's favor in 1529, through the careful, precise, utterly unsentimental process of being more useful to the king than any man who had preceded him. By 1536, Thomas Cromwell was Henry's chief minister. He was also, in a very practical sense, Henry's problem solver, the man who made things go away. The man who understood that a king's wishes, spoken aloud or not, required someone with the institutional knowledge and the personal willingness to translate them into outcomes. And Cromwell was paying close attention to the direction of the wind in early 1536. He watched Henry's mood shift after the miscarriage. He watched the king's attention move, openly now, in a way that was past the point of discretion, toward a quiet, fair-skinned young woman named Jane Seymour. Jane was the daughter of Sir John Seymour of Wiltshire. She was a lady in waiting. She was modest in manner and careful in presentation, and notably, deliberately, pointedly, everything that the bold, quick-tongued, politically aggressive Anne Boleyn was not. Historians have argued for centuries about the precise mechanics of what followed. How much was Henry's initiative, and how much was Cromwell's engineering, and how much was a kind of silent collaboration between a king who wanted to be free and a minister who understood perfectly how to free him. The evidence does not give us a clean answer. What the evidence gives us is the outcome. By late April 1536, Thomas Cromwell had a list of names, and Anne Boleyn was not on the list. She was the reason for the list. The names were of men who served at court, men who had been in proximity to the Queen. men against whom charges of adultery with the Queen could be constructed. Charges that, under the Treason Act that Cromwell himself had helped engineer in 1534, carried the death penalty not only for them, but for her. The charges were adultery and incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, and conspiracy to murder the king. The evidence, examined by every serious historian who has approached the primary sources in the 4 centuries since, is, to be as precise as the record demands, essentially non-existent. What Cromwell had was mostly rumor, court gossip, and one musician. His name was Mark Smeaton. He was a court musician of low birth, a significant detail in the class-conscious world of Tudor England, where the idea that a queen might lower herself to sleep with a commoner was considered almost more scandalous than the adultery itself. On April 30th, 1536, Mark Smeaton was taken in for questioning. By the following morning, he had confessed. He was the only one who ever did. What happened in those hours between his arrest and his confession, we do not know with certainty. Cromwell's enemies later claimed torture. Cromwell's records are silent on the point. Smeaton was a young man of no political standing, no family protection, and no leverage whatsoever. He was entirely alone in a room with people who already knew what answer they needed. He gave it to them. The following day, May 1st, 1536, May Day, a festival, a day of celebration, Henry VIII was watching a joust at Greenwich. He received a message. He stood up, and without explanation, without ceremony, he left. Anne Boleyn watched him go. She did not yet know that she would never see him outside a formal proceeding again. The morning after that, May 2nd, 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London by barge. She arrived at the very same gate through which she had entered, magnificently, in her coronation procession 3 years earlier. 17 days. That is what remains. From the moment Anne Boleyn entered the Tower of London under arrest to the moment a French swordsman, specially imported from Calais because the English headsman used an axe, and Henry had apparently decided that a sword was the more merciful choice, though the mercy of that distinction seems thin when you think about it clearly, ended her life on Tower Green. 17 days, and inside those 17 days, a trial. A verdict reached in under an hour by a jury that included her own former suitor, Henry Percy, who wept during the proceedings, and her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who read the guilty verdict aloud without any visible expression on his face. The execution of 5 men, 4 of whom died insisting on their innocence from the scaffold, at the moment in their lives when lying would have imperiled their immortal souls. The annulment of Anne's marriage to Henry, declared invalid 2 days before her death by the Archbishop of Canterbury, meaning Anne Boleyn was executed not as a queen, not as a wife, but as a woman whose marriage had been retroactively declared never to have legally existed. And then, the morning after the execution, an engagement announcement. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour betrothed, publicly, with what the historical record describes as remarkable cheerfulness on his part. 11 days later, they were married. I told you to hold on to 3 things. We have not finished with any of them yet. There is a particular kind of dread that arrives not with a shock, but with a slow, spreading certainty, the kind that does not announce itself, that simply settles into your bones over hours and days until you realize it has been there the whole time, and the not knowing was only ever a mercy you were allowing yourself. Anne Boleyn knew the Tower of London. She had slept there before, in the royal apartments on the northeastern side of the complex. Comfortable rooms, furnished rooms, rooms with fires and tapestries, and attendants who addressed you as your majesty. The night before a coronation, by tradition, English monarchs lodged inside the tower. And so, in May of 1533, 3 years and 12 days before her arrest, Anne Boleyn had spent her last night as a private citizen inside those same walls, surrounded by her ladies, her jewels, her absolute certainty that everything she had worked for was about to arrive. On the morning of May 2nd, 1536, she arrived by barge. The same water, the same stone, the same gate. When she stepped off that barge and stood at the entrance to the tower, she reportedly asked whether she would be taken to a dungeon. The constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, told her no. She would be lodged in the same apartments she had occupied before her coronation. According to Kingston's own letters, which survive, and which historians consider among the most reliable primary sources for what followed, Anne replied, and this is documented, his exact report of her words, that it was too good for her. Then she began to laugh. Not the laughter of someone who found anything funny. The laughter of someone whose nervous system was doing the only thing it had left to do. Kingston reported that she wept as well, repeatedly, cycling between tears and that terrible, involuntary laughter over the hours that followed. He wrote to Cromwell about her behavior with what reads, even across 5 centuries, as a man genuinely unsettled by what he was observing. She was not performing hysteria. She was not making a scene. She was a woman who had just understood, fully and completely, that the door she had walked through was not going to open again. Here's a detail about Tudor imprisonment that most people do not know, and that matters enormously when you are trying to understand what those 17 days inside the tower actually felt like for Anne Boleyn. You were not left alone, not in the way a modern prisoner is left alone, with silence, with isolation, with the small mercy of privacy. Tudor practice, particularly for high-status prisoners, involved the constant presence of attendants, ladies in waiting, women assigned to keep her company, to attend to her needs, to make sure she was comfortable, women who were also reporting everything she said directly to Thomas Cromwell. We know this because their reports survive. Kingston wrote regularly to Cromwell, passing along Anne's conversations almost verbatim. What she said in the hours after her arrival, what she said in the middle of the night when she could not sleep, what she said about the men who had been arrested alongside her, what she said about the king, what she said about herself. She said a great deal. Shock does that. Isolation, masquerading as company, does that. You talk because the alternative is sitting alone inside your own head with the full weight of what is happening to you. And talking feels like proof that you are still a person with something to say. Some of what she said was used against her at trial. Not because it was incriminating in any meaningful sense, but because words extracted from a frightened woman in the middle of the night, stripped of their context, shaped into evidence by men who already knew the verdict they needed. Words can become almost anything you require them to become, given the right hands and the right purpose. She mentioned Henry Norris once. She had apparently had a sharp exchange with Norris in the days before her arrest, a conversation about courtly flirtation, the kind of coded, half-playful language that was completely standard at the Tudor court, the language in which attraction was acknowledged and then carefully, elaborately denied. She had said something to Norris that could, in the worst possible reading, be made to sound like more than it was. In the worst possible reading was exactly where Cromwell needed it to live. Henry Norris was Henry VIII's groom of the stool, his closest personal attendant, the man who had more daily physical access to the king's person than almost anyone else at court. He was one of Henry's most trusted companions. He had served him for years. He was arrested. He was offered the chance to confess and save his life. He refused. Remember that refusal. It will matter. 5 men were arrested in connection with the charges against Anne Boleyn. Mark Smeaton, the musician, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, a young courtier who had been at court since his teens, William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber who had served Henry for over a decade, and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, Viscount Rochford, a man of considerable intelligence and considerable ambition who had been one of the most visible members of the Boleyn faction at court. The charge against George included something specific and specifically horrifying, that he and his sister had committed incest. The evidence for this charge was, by any reasonable standard, nothing. The primary witness was George's own wife, Jane Parker, Lady Rochford, a woman whose marriage to George appears to have been deeply unhappy, and whose testimony against him historians have argued about ever since in terms of its reliability, its motivation, and the degree to which it was coerced or volunteered. What Jane Parker told Cromwell's investigators remains partially reconstructed, since the actual documentation is fragmentary, but she appears to have relayed private conversations that could be twisted into something suggestive. That was enough. In 1536, in a trial controlled by the Crown. The men were tried on May 12, 1536, all except George, who was tried separately on May 15th, the same day as Anne. They were tried before a commission that included, in several cases, men who owed their positions to Thomas Cromwell. The trial was not designed to establish truth. It was designed to produce a verdict. It produced one, guilty, all of them, guilty. And on May 17th, 1536, 2 days before Anne's execution, 4 of the 5 men died on Tower Hill. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton. George Boleyn died with them. Now, here is the moment I need you to pay attention to. These men were standing on a scaffold. They were about to die. Every one of them was a man of faith, genuine faith, the faith of an era that took the literal, physical reality of heaven and hell with a seriousness that is difficult for us to fully reconstruct. They believed, with the certainty of their entire world, that lying at the moment of death endangered the eternal fate of their souls. Henry Norris said, from the scaffold, that he believed Anne to be innocent. Francis Weston said he had deserved death for other sins committed in his life, but not for the ones he had been charged with. William Brereton said he had been unjustly condemned, and he challenged anyone to say otherwise. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, a man who died accused of the most intimate imaginable betrayal of his own family, gave a speech on the scaffold that pointedly refused to confirm any of the charges against him. He said he deserved death, as all sinners deserved death. He did not say he had committed the acts for which he stood condemned. 4 men, 4 separate executions, 4 separate opportunities to confess, to express remorse for the specific acts charged, to die with the peace of acknowledged guilt. 4 refusals. The only man who did not clearly deny the charges from the scaffold was Mark Smeaton. Mark Smeaton, who had confessed under circumstances no serious historian defends as clean. Mark Smeaton, who was a commoner with no family, no political protectors, and no one to appeal to. Mark Smeaton, who may have been told that a confession would spare his life, and who discovered, on the morning of his execution, that the promise, if it was ever made, had not been kept. That was the charge. Those were the confessions. One man, under circumstances no serious historian defends as clean. Ask yourself what you believe. On May 15th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was tried in the King's Hall of the Tower of London before a panel of peers. 2,000 people were permitted to watch. 2,000. This was not a secret proceeding. This was not a quiet, administrative matter handled in a back room. This was a spectacle, and it was designed to be one, because the spectacle was the message. The message was that the king had not simply decided to be rid of his wife. The message was that justice had been done. Procedures had been followed, and the woman standing before the court had been found wanting not by the king's whim, but by the full and impartial machinery of English law. The full and impartial machinery of English law, presided over by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Composed of peers who had been selected by Cromwell. Hearing evidence that consisted largely of reported conversations extracted from a frightened prisoner in the middle of the night, filtered through attendants who were also Cromwell's informants. Anne conducted her defense. This is important. She was not silent. She was not passive. She was not a woman who had accepted the outcome and simply waited for it to arrive. She answered the charges. She challenged the evidence. She was, by multiple accounts of those present, composed, clear, articulate, and entirely convincing to anyone who had not already decided the verdict. The verdict had been decided. It was reached in approximately 1 hour. Guilty. The sentence was death, either by burning or beheading, at the king's discretion. Henry chose beheading. And then, in what historians have often noted as a gesture whose mercy is difficult to separate from its grotesquerie, he specified that instead of the standard English axe, a French swordsman would be brought from Calais to perform the execution. The sword was considered the more refined, more humane method. It was also the method used for men of rank and distinction. It was, in its way, one last acknowledgement that she had been his queen. She had 4 days. William Kingston continued writing to Cromwell throughout those 4 days. His letters give us something remarkable, not the formal record of Anne Boleyn, not the legal document or the official account, but something closer to the actual texture of what those days were like for the woman living them. She talked about the men who had died. She said she believed Norris had done this for her. She worried about what people would say. She asked about her brother George repeatedly, about how he had died, about what he had said, about whether he had been afraid. She asked about the nature of death, whether it would hurt, whether it would be swift. At one point, according to Kingston, she put her hand to her throat and said, "He wrote this down," that she had a little neck and laughed, that terrible laughter again, that involuntary, uncontrollable response of a person standing at the absolute edge of what the human nervous system can accommodate, and finding that somewhere in the gap between the unbearable and the impossible, there is apparently still room for dark, helpless, devastating humor. She had a little neck. She was not wrong. She was right. The French swordsman, brought specifically for his skill and speed, completed the execution in a single blow on the morning of May 19th, 1536. She had prepared a speech. She delivered it. It is remembered, among Tudor historians, as one of the most extraordinary scaffold speeches of the period, not because she protested her innocence, but because she conspicuously, pointedly, carefully did not. She praised the king. She asked God to have mercy on his soul and to protect the realm. She said she hoped everyone would judge her charitably. What she did not do was confess to a single thing she had been charged with. Her body was placed in an arrow chest because no one had thought to provide a proper coffin, and buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula inside the Tower of London. The same grounds where she had walked, the same walls she had looked at from her window for 19 days. The next morning, Henry VIII announced his engagement to Jane Seymour. And in a nursery at Hatfield, a 2-year-old girl sat with her nurses and did not understand why her mother had stopped coming. Her name was Elizabeth. We are not done with her yet. Before we get to the trial, I need you to know 5 names. Not because they are footnotes, not because they are minor characters in someone else's story, but because they are the weight the whole case rests on, and because what each of them chose to say and not say in the last minutes of their lives is either the most powerful evidence this story contains or the most carefully ignored. Their names were Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn. 5 men charged with adultery with the Queen of England. 5 men charged with conspiracy to murder the king. And 1 additional charge leveled at just one of them, so explosive that even in an era accustomed to political theater, it stopped the room cold: incest. George Boleyn was Anne's own brother. 4 of these 5 men walked to the scaffold on May 17th, 1536, and denied every single charge in the presence of God, on the threshold of eternity, at the precise moment when a devout Christian man had every spiritual reason in the world to confess anything he had actually done. In 16th century England, dying unconfessed, dying with a lie on your lips before God, was not a small thing. It was not a minor gamble. The theology of the age was unambiguous. You stood before your Maker with the full account of your soul, and if you had sinned, you confessed it, and you hoped for mercy. To maintain a lie on the scaffold was, by every belief these men held, to risk your immortal soul. 4 of them did it anyway. Sit with that for a moment. Here is something Thomas Cromwell understood that most people, then and now, do not fully appreciate. You do not need evidence to build a case. You need structure. You need the right legal tools, the right witnesses in the right rooms, the right questions asked in the right order, and enough momentum that by the time anyone stops to ask whether any of it is true, the verdict is already in. Cromwell had spent his entire career learning how power worked in Tudor England. He had watched Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man in the kingdom, the man who had effectively run England for nearly 2 decades, destroyed in a matter of months when Henry withdrew his favor. He had absorbed that lesson with the sharp attention of a man who knew he would need it someday. And by the spring of 1536, Cromwell had 3 things working simultaneously in the same direction. He had Henry, emotionally disengaged from Anne after the miscarriage, his attention visibly redirected toward Jane Seymour, not yet making any formal request, but producing the political atmosphere of a man ready for a change. He had a legal framework. The Treason Act of 1534, legislation that Cromwell himself had helped engineer, had expanded the definition of treason to include spoken words, not just actions, words. This was new, and it was controversial, and it was extraordinarily useful. It meant that a conversation, a remark allegedly made by Anne about the king's performance in the bedchamber, a comment about what might happen if the king were to die, could be reconstructed from testimony, from memory, from the accounts of people who had been in the room and charged as treason. You did not need a weapon. You did not need a document. You needed someone who was willing to say they had heard the right thing. And third, Cromwell had enemies of Anne who had been waiting for this moment for years. The conservative Catholic faction at court, the Seymours, certain members of the old nobility, those who had supported Catherine of Aragon and resented the evangelical reformism that Anne represented, had watched Anne's power accumulate for 6 years. They had survived her coronation. They had survived the break with Rome. They had survived the birth of Elizabeth, who had technically displaced Catherine's daughter Mary in the succession. They had been waiting, as the politically defeated always wait, for the tide to turn. In early 1536, they could feel it turning. And somewhere in April of that year, the exact date is not in the surviving record, Cromwell began asking questions. Mark Smeaton was the first. He was not a nobleman. He was not a gentleman. He was a court musician, talented enough to have been appointed as one of the king's own musicians, which was a genuine honor and a genuine position, but a position that also came with a clear understanding of his place in the Tudor hierarchy. He was a craftsman who served at court. He was, in the language of the age, a man of low birth. That status matters. It matters in 2 ways that the record does not spell out, but that are obvious once you understand the mechanics of what Cromwell was building. The first is that Mark Smeaton had no family of consequence behind him, no powerful father, no influential uncle, no network of noblemen who would make difficulties if he disappeared into a room with Cromwell's men and came out saying something he had not said before. He was, in the most practical sense, alone. The second is that the idea of a Queen of England sleeping with a musician, with a common craftsman, a man of her household staff, was considered almost more scandalous than the adultery itself. In the class-conscious world of Tudor England, the suggestion carried a specific kind of degradation. It implied that Anne had not merely been unfaithful, she had been indiscriminate, that she had thrown her dignity and the dignity of the crown past the aristocracy and into the servants' quarters. If you wanted to make a queen look like she had no judgment, no pride, and no morals, putting a musician in the charge sheet was a deliberate choice. On April 30th, 1536, Mark Smeaton was taken in for questioning. The exact location is debated. Some accounts say he was brought to Cromwell's own house at Stepney. Others suggest a different location. The exact interrogation record has not survived. What survives is the outcome. By the following morning, he had confessed to adultery with the Queen. He was the only one who ever confessed to anything. How that confession was obtained is the central evidentiary question of this entire case, and the historical record does not give us a clean answer. Alison Weir, after detailed examination of the available sources, argues that some form of duress was applied, possibly physical, possibly a form of sustained psychological pressure that left no documentary trace. Some later accounts mention the rack. Cromwell's own records are silent on the point, which is itself suggestive. A man who kept meticulous administrative records of almost everything he touched left no account of this particular interview. What we know is this: Mark Smeaton was a young man of no social standing and no institutional protection. He was in a room with men who already knew the answer they needed, and he gave it to them. The documentary record notes one additional detail that has struck historians as significant. At Smeaton's eventual execution on May 17th, he did not fully retract his confession. He did not follow the other men's lead and die denying the charges. His scaffold speech was notably different, less clear, less absolute, more ambiguous in its language about guilt and innocence. Historians have read this in different ways. Some see it as the behavior of a man who could not recant what had been extracted from him by force, because recanting would raise questions about how the confession was obtained. Others, most notably G.W. Bernard, whose minority revisionist scholarship suggests the possibility of genuine guilt, have read it differently. The majority view in modern scholarship is that the confession was not freely given. But the historical record does not allow us to say more than that with certainty. What the record does allow us to say is this. On the evening of April 30th, 1536, after Smeaton's questioning, Cromwell had a confession. He had the structure of a case. And the next morning, May 1st, 1536, May Day, a festival, a day of official celebrations, Henry VIII was in the royal box at a tournament at Greenwich watching his courtiers joust. And he received a message. He stood up. He left. Witnesses later recorded that his face had changed, that he was suddenly, quietly, intensely gone. He rode for London with a small party, leaving the tournament, leaving the feast, leaving Anne behind at Greenwich without explanation. Anne watched him go. She had no idea what the message said. She may have thought, that it was court business, that he would return, that the tournament would continue. It did not continue, not for her. The arrests moved quickly after that, quickly enough that if you look at the calendar and consider the logistics involved, the formal charges, the legal instruments, the arrangement of guards, the preparation of Tower accommodations for multiple high-ranking prisoners, you realize the machinery had been assembled before the first arrest was made. Henry Norris was taken on May 2nd, the same day as Anne. He was, by any measure, a significant man. He was the groom of the stool, one of the most intimate positions in the royal household, a man whose job involved attending the king in his most private moments, a man Henry had trusted at close quarters for years. If Norris was guilty, it meant the betrayal had come from inside Henry's most intimate circle. If Norris was not guilty, it meant Cromwell was willing to destroy even the king's closest personal servants to build the case. Norris was offered a deal. According to the record, Henry himself apparently sent a message suggesting that if Norris confessed and threw himself on the king's mercy, he might be spared. It was, in the cold arithmetic of the situation, a reasonable offer. Confess to something you may not have done and possibly live. Deny it and almost certainly die. Henry Norris said no. He denied the charges. He maintained his denial through his arrest, his imprisonment, his trial, and his execution. He died on Tower Hill on May 17th, still denying everything. Francis Weston was young, in his mid-20s. He was wealthy, titled, and by contemporary accounts, a charming presence at court. His family sent petitions begging for his life. His wife wrote to Henry. His mother wrote to Henry. The petitions did not work. He was executed alongside Norris, Brereton, and Smeaton on May 17th, and like Norris, he died denying the charges. William Brereton was older than the others, probably in his 40s. He was a powerful administrator with significant influence in Wales, and some historians have suggested that Cromwell may have had independent political reasons for wanting Brereton removed entirely apart from the Anne case. If true, and it is a serious scholarly argument, made most clearly by Eric Ives, it means Brereton may have been added to the list not because of any specific accusation against him, but because his removal was convenient, and the Anne case provided the vehicle. He died denying the charges. And then there was George Boleyn. George was Anne's brother. He was sophisticated, well-read, religiously reformist in his sympathies, and by contemporary accounts as politically intelligent as his sister. The charge against him, incest, was, even in a case full of extreme accusations, something that made the court catch its breath. The charge required a specific kind of testimony to construct. Someone had to say that Anne and George had been intimate, and historians have identified the most likely source of that testimony as George Boleyn's own wife. Her name was Jane Parker. She is known in history as Lady Rochford. Her marriage to George was, by most accounts, not a happy one. The specific reasons are not documented with certainty. Court gossip of the period suggests personal incompatibility, but we cannot know more than that. What the record suggests, carefully, is that Jane Parker may have provided statements to Cromwell's investigators that helped construct the case against both her husband and her sister-in-law. The word may is doing important work in that sentence. Jane Parker's exact role remains debated. What is not debated is that she later fell from royal favor herself. She was executed in 1542 alongside Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, and that at her own death, she reportedly confessed to having given false testimony in 1536. She did not live long enough to undo what that testimony may have built. Here is where the calendar becomes the most important document in the entire case. Thomas Cromwell, in constructing the charges against Anne, needed to be specific. The legal format required dates, locations, and named individuals. So the charge sheet listed particular dates on which Anne was alleged to have committed adultery, specific days, specific places. Eric Ives, the historian whose 4 decades of work on Anne Boleyn represent the most thorough, scholarly examination of the primary sources, examined these dates one by one against the documented court records, the administrative logs, the household accounts, the diplomatic correspondence that places specific individuals at specific locations on specific days. What he found was this. In several instances, the dates specified in the charges were dates on which either Anne or the accused man could demonstrably not have been at the stated location. Not probably wasn't there, could demonstrably not have been there, based on the existing record. One charge placed Anne and an accused man together at a specific location on a date, when court records show they were in different places. Another listed a date when the accused man was not at court at all. Cromwell's investigators, working quickly, had constructed a charge sheet that did not survive basic fact-checking. This is not the same as proving innocence. Ives himself was careful about that. The absence of proof that a meeting occurred on a specific date is not the same as proof the meeting never occurred. What the inconsistencies demonstrate is something more procedural, and in some ways more damning. They demonstrate that the charges were assembled without rigorous attention to whether the stated dates were even possible, which tells you something about how much attention anyone expected the dates to receive. The trial lasted 1 day. The verdict took about an hour. I want to come back to those 4 men, because here is the thing about scaffold denials in Tudor England that is easy to miss if you are approaching it from a secular 21st century perspective. These men were not atheists. They were not men who had decided the afterlife was a comfortable fiction. They were devout Christians living in an era when the terror of dying unconfessed, of standing before God, carrying the guilt of unacknowledged sin, was as real and as immediate to them as the scaffold they stood on. The conventional scaffold speech of the period had a specific structure. You acknowledge the justice of the king's law. You ask for mercy for your soul. You confessed your sins. You did not necessarily confess to the specific charge, that was not always required, but you expressed general contrition and made peace with God. 4 of these men, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, George Boleyn, stood on that scaffold and, in the most spiritually charged moment of their lives, chose to die maintaining their innocence of the specific charges against them. They are not here to explain why, but the choice they made is documented, and it sits in the record like a stone that cannot be moved. Was it pride? Was it loyalty to Anne? Was it a last act of defiance against a process they knew had been corrupted? Was it simply the truth? The record does not tell us which of those explanations is correct. It only tells us what they chose to do. And I want you to hold that choice in mind as we move into the trial itself, because the trial is where everything comes together. The charges, the jury, the speed, the verdict. The single day in which the fate of a Queen of England was formally decided by men who, in several cases, had every political reason in the world to reach a particular conclusion. That is chapter 4. But before we get there, remember the 2-year-old girl at Hatfield. She does not yet know that her father has just ordered the arrest of 5 men on the basis of charges that will be executed in 17 days. She does not know what is coming. She is 2 years old. She is healthy and unaware, and waiting for a mother who is never going to be allowed to come back. The calendar is still counting. Here is a question I want you to sit with before anything else. You are standing on a scaffold in 1536. You are about to die. The crowd is watching. The priest is beside you. And in the theology of the world you live in, the world every person around you lives in, this is the moment that matters more than every other moment of your entire life combined. Because in a few minutes, your soul is going somewhere. And whether it goes somewhere good or somewhere else is, in the understanding of every person present, directly connected to whether you leave this world with the truth on your lips. You are a devout Christian in the 16th century. You do not think metaphorically about your immortal soul. You think literally. You think practically. The priest is right there. Confession, if it is real, wipes the record clean. And there is one way to make absolutely certain your soul is clean before you go. Tell the truth, now, given all of that. 4 men stood on that scaffold on May 17th, 1536, and denied every charge against them. Not quietly, not ambiguously. Each of them, one by one, stood before God and a watching crowd and said, "I am innocent of what I was convicted of." They had nothing left to lose by confessing. The sentence had been handed down. The axe was already there. Lying on that scaffold could not save their bodies, but telling the truth in the belief system they carried to the moment of their deaths could save something far more important. They told the truth as they understood it, and the truth as they understood it was, "I did not do this." That is the single most powerful piece of evidence in the entire Anne Boleyn case. It does not appear in the trial record. It does not require a legal argument. It does not need footnotes. It is simply 4 men at the last possible moment saying the same thing. "I did not do this." Let me tell you who they were. Because history has a habit of leaving men without names when they are not important enough to be kings or traitors. These 5 were not important enough to survive as full people in the popular memory of 1536. But they were important enough to die for it. Henry Norris, groom of the stool, which is exactly what it sounds like, and also considerably more than it sounds like. The groom of the stool was the most intimate, personal attendant to the king. He was present at Henry's most private moments. He was trusted in the way you only trust someone when trust is a physical necessity. Norris was, by all accounts, one of Henry's genuinely close companions. Not just a servant, but a man who had served the king in proximity for years, the kind of closeness that does not happen without some form of genuine regard. He was accused of adultery with the Queen on multiple specific occasions. He denied it from the scaffold. He had, in fact, been offered a way out. Reports survive suggesting Henry VIII personally offered Norris a pardon if he would simply confess. If he would give the crown what it needed, a senior courtier's testimony confirming the charges, he would live. Norris said no. Think about that. A man who had spent his career in proximity to power, who understood exactly how Tudor royal mercy worked and how rarely it was extended, was offered his life. The price was a lie that cost someone else hers. He said no. William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, long-serving, wealthy, with extensive landholdings in Wales. Of the 5 accused men, historians note that Brereton has the weakest documented connection to Anne Boleyn. The evidence linking him to the specific charges is, even by the standards of the fabricated case, unusually thin. His inclusion in the list has led some historians, including Alison Weir, to suggest that Cromwell may have had additional personal or political reasons to want Brereton specifically removed. He denied the charges from the scaffold. Francis Weston, the youngest of the accused, in his mid-20s, he had actually, in a strange footnote that the trial record caught and amplified, been in a conversation with Anne Boleyn in which she reportedly teased him about his attraction to another woman at court. The exchange, documented in the notes of Anne's Tower conversations, was taken by the prosecution as evidence of intimacy. What it actually reads as, in the primary sources, is the kind of sharp, playful court banter that Anne Boleyn was known for. Weston's family reportedly offered an enormous sum for his life. The money was not accepted. He denied the charges from the scaffold. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, and here the charges become something else entirely. The accusation of incest, that Anne Boleyn had committed adultery with her own brother, is, in the view of essentially every serious historian who has examined the primary sources, the most transparently constructed charge in the entire indictment. There is no evidence for it beyond the testimony of one woman, George's wife, Jane Parker Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Jane's precise role in her husband's destruction has itself been the subject of centuries of debate. Whether she gave testimony willingly, was pressured, or was manipulated into providing information she did not fully understand would be used this way, historians do not agree. What the record shows is that information from Jane Boleyn reached Cromwell and was used in the construction of the case. At George's trial on May 15th, the prosecution included something extraordinary. A written paper was passed to George. He was not supposed to read it aloud, only to reply yes or no to the question it contained. The question alleged that his wife had reported a private conversation between George and Anne regarding Henry's sexual performance and virility. George read the paper aloud to the entire assembled courtroom. Whether he did this as a deliberate act of defiance, exposing the specific nature of the charge so the world could hear how thin it was, or whether he simply miscalculated the instruction, is something historians have argued. What is certain is that the room understood what had just happened, and George Boleyn, at his own trial, on the day he would be condemned, had made public something the Crown would perhaps have preferred to keep contained. he was convicted. And on May 17th, he denied everything from the scaffold. And then there was Mark Smeaton, the court musician, the only one who had confessed. By the time he stood on the scaffold, Mark Smeaton's situation was different from the others. He had given a confession. He had not, at any point between his initial confession and his death, formally retracted it. He did not, from the scaffold, explicitly say the confession was false, but he also said in the transcription that survives, "Masters, I pray you all pray for me, for I have deserved the death." He did not say he was guilty of what he had been convicted of. He said he deserved death. In the theological language of 1536, those two statements are not the same thing. Historians have read this language in different ways, but what Smeaton did not do, standing at the same moment where, if his confession had been truthful, affirming it would have been the natural thing, was confirm that he had been Anne Boleyn's lover. He said he deserved to die. And then he did. 2 days before Anne's execution, on May 17th, 1536, the same day the 5 men died on Tower Hill, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, annulled Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. He declared it invalid, retroactively, as though it had never legally existed. Let the full weight of that settle for a moment. Anne Boleyn was about to be executed for crimes committed as Henry's wife. The entire legal structure of the case against her rested on her being his queen. Adultery was treason specifically because a queen's infidelity could, in theory, corrupt the royal bloodline. The crime required her to be married to Henry for it to be the crime it was charged as. 2 days before her execution, the marriage was annulled. She was going to die as a woman who had never legally been Henry's wife. Historians note this legal irregularity with varying degrees of emphasis. Eric Ives points it out as one of the numerous procedural abnormalities in the case. Others note that Cranmer, the same Cranmer Anne's influence had helped place as archbishop, the man who owed his position in no small part to her patronage, performed the annulment with what the record describes as visible personal distress. He reportedly wept. He wrote to Henry asking if there was any possibility of mercy. Henry's response, if there was one, does not survive in the record. What survived was the annulment, signed, complete. Anne Boleyn was no longer Henry's wife. She had 2 days to live. She had been in the Tower since May 2nd, 17 days in total. For much of that time, her ladies-in-waiting, women appointed specifically to watch her, some of whom were reporting her conversations directly to Cromwell, surrounded her. She knew this, or suspected it. The conversations recorded by Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, show a woman oscillating between composure and fear, between dark humor and genuine distress. She reportedly said, at one point, that she would be called Queen Anne Lackhead, dark humor, in the Tower, days before her execution. That tells you something about who she was. The execution had originally been scheduled for May 18th. It was postponed by 1 day. The reason is not definitively established in the sources. Some accounts suggest logistical delays. Others suggest the French swordsman had not yet arrived. Others that the legal paperwork required additional time. Whatever the cause, Anne spent an additional 24 hours knowing what the morning after would bring. She received the sacrament on the morning of May 19th. She reportedly said she felt no fear. She was led from her chamber to Tower Green, not to Tower Hill, the public execution site where the 5 men had died 2 days earlier. Tower Green was inside the Tower walls. The audience was selected, a few hundred witnesses, officials, and observers, not the general public. Queens did not die where commoners died. Even in this, there was protocol. The scaffold was low. Witnesses noted it. Anne mounted it. She removed her headdress. Her ladies, the same ladies who had been watching her and reporting on her, were weeping. Anne, by multiple contemporary accounts, was composed. She spoke. I want to be precise about her scaffold speech, because it has been misquoted, romanticized, and misread in enough places that the actual record deserves its due. Multiple transcriptions survive, with minor variations between them. The most frequently cited version comes from the Chronicle of Edward Hall, and the account of Lancelot de Carles, a French diplomat who was present or received near contemporary reports. The variations between transcriptions are small enough that historians are confident about the essential content. She did not confess to the charges. She did not accuse Henry by name. She did not name Cromwell. She did not name the men who had constructed the case against her. She did not scream. She did not weep. She praised the king. She said, in substance, not verbatim, that she prayed God would save the king, that she had found him a good, gentle, and sovereign lord, and that she submitted to the law, which had always been used justly against her. Read that last clause again, which has always been used justly against her. Historians have spent decades examining whether that phrase contains irony, whether a woman facing death on fabricated charges, speaking in a formal context where every word would be reported back to the man who had ordered her death, was capable of encoding sarcasm in language polished enough to seem compliant. We cannot know. What we can say is this: she did not confess. She praised the king, and she made no statement that would have given Henry reason to act against her daughter. That last point matters. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Her status, declared illegitimate after her parents' marriage was annulled, was precarious. Any final speech by Anne that could be read as accusatory or politically dangerous could have been used as justification for further action against the child. Anne knew this. She had been a political operator for 15 years. She understood how information worked in the Tudor court. Her silence on the charges was not absence of thought. It was the last political act of a woman who understood her audience. She knelt. She removed her coif so the swordsman had a clear line. She reportedly kept turning her head, anxious in these final seconds. A contemporary account records that she repeated the phrase, "O Lord God, have mercy on my soul," several times, steadily. The French swordsman, whose name does not survive in the record, stepped forward. It took one stroke. There was no proper coffin prepared. Her body was placed into an elm chest, the kind used to store arrows. It had not been prepared in advance. Whether this was an administrative oversight or something else is not something the record clarifies. What it shows is that the logistics of Anne Boleyn's death had been planned with considerable care. The French swordsman, the location, the selected audience, and the logistics of what happened to her afterward had not received the same attention. She was buried beneath the altar of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the tower walls. No public ceremony, no procession, no monument. She was 34 or 35 years old. Historians still debate the precise birth year. The chapel still stands. 3 centuries later, during Victorian restoration work ordered by Queen Victoria, the floor of the chapel was excavated. Human remains were identified and reinterred with care. Anne Boleyn lies there now, beneath a marble stone, with her name on it. It took 300 years for her name to appear on anything at the site of her burial. the morning of May 20th, 1536. Henry VIII was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Not quietly, not privately, formally, with witnesses, with the proper institutional forms, with the announcement that followed betrothal in a world where betrothal was a legal status with its own weight. Think about what that requires. A royal betrothal is not two people deciding to marry. It is a legal arrangement with papers, witnesses, and public declaration. The preparations for that betrothal, the communication, the logistics, the legal readiness, do not happen overnight. They do not happen in the hours between an execution and an announcement. They happen before. The documentary does not claim this as proof of conspiracy in a criminal legal sense. The historical record does not give us that certainty. What the historical record gives us is a date and a gap, 17 days, and then the morning after, and then 11 days later, a wedding. The calendar is not making an accusation. The calendar is doing something quieter than that. The calendar is simply present. We are not finished. The 2-year-old girl in the nursery at Hatfield, the one I asked you to hold on to at the very beginning of this story, is still waiting. The ledger is not closed. Not yet. 4 men chose their immortal souls over a lie. That is the sentence to hold on to as we move through the morning of May 17th, 1536. Before Anne Boleyn walked to any scaffold, before a single note from that French swordsman's blade, 4 men climbed the steps at Tower Hill, and at the moment their Christian faith told them mattered most, the moment between this world and whatever comes next, looked out at the crowd gathered to watch them die, and said, "We did not do this, not one of them." Think about what that means for a moment. In Tudor England, the scaffold speech was not a formality. It was not a performance. For a man who genuinely believed in the Christian faith, and by all accounts, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn were devout men. The moments before execution were the most theologically significant of their entire lives. The church was unambiguous on this point. To die with a lie in your mouth, an unconfessed mortal sin on your soul, was to risk eternal damnation. Not metaphorical damnation, not the vague cultural damnation of someone who doesn't believe it. Real, literal, 16th century eternal hellfire. The only thing they had left, the only currency they had left to spend, was the truth. And all 4 of them spent it the same way. Henry Norris went first, or among the first. The precise order on Tower Hill that morning is not definitively established in the surviving records. What is established is what he said. He maintained his innocence. He was the groom of the stool, the man who had been closer to Henry's daily physical presence than almost anyone alive. And he died rather than confirm the story the Crown needed confirmed. He had been offered a chance, earlier in the process, to confess in exchange for his life. The record suggests he declined. He was approximately in his 40s. He had served Henry for years. He understood exactly what he was doing when he said no. Francis Weston was around 25 years old. 25. He had a wife at home. He had a young son. His family reportedly tried desperately to secure a pardon, paying what records suggest was a substantial sum. The pardon did not come. Francis Weston climbed the steps at Tower Hill at roughly the age at which most men are just beginning to understand that life is real. And he died insisting he had not done what they said he had done. His youth is not incidental to this story. Cromwell's net had been cast wide enough to catch a 25-year-old who had been nowhere near the levers of power, whose primary offense appears to have been that he was at court and that his name came up. William Brereton was older, a gentleman in the royal household, connected to significant landholdings in Cheshire. His inclusion in the charges has puzzled historians more than any other accused man. The specific evidence linking him to Anne was thin, even by the already threadbare standards of this prosecution. Eric Ives, in his exhaustive analysis of the case, suggested that Brereton's inclusion may have had more to do with Cromwell's regional political objectives in Cheshire than with anything involving Anne. In other words, it is possible that Brereton died not because the crown needed him to confirm a story about the Queen, but because Cromwell needed his political network dismantled. He died denying everything anyway. And then there was George Boleyn, Anne's brother. George Boleyn had been charged not just with adultery, but with incest. The charge was, even by the already considerable standards of this prosecution's reach, extraordinary. It was also, in the view of virtually every serious historian who has examined it, almost certainly fabricated from testimony provided, at least in part, by his own wife, Jane Parker Boleyn, later known to history as Lady Rochford. Jane Parker Boleyn's precise role in the construction of the case against her husband is one of the most debated details in the entire historiography. What appears established is that she provided information to Cromwell's investigators. The nature and extent of that information is not fully clear from surviving records. She outlived both her husband and Anne by 6 years, and then was herself executed in 1542, alongside Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife. Whatever she had done, or had been coerced into doing, in the spring of 1536 did not protect her in the end. George Boleyn's trial on May 15th produced one of the most remarkable moments in the entire proceedings, a moment so vivid that multiple eyewitnesses recorded it, including the hostile Spanish ambassador Chapuis, who had every reason to downplay anything that might cast doubt on the Crown's case. During his trial, George was shown a piece of paper. The paper contained an allegation that his wife had told Anne that the king was sexually inadequate. George was told essentially to answer yes or no without reading it aloud. The implied assumption was that reading such a statement publicly would be so embarrassing, so damaging to the king's dignity, that no sane man would choose to do it. George Boleyn read it aloud anyway. He read it to the entire court, every word. Chapuis recorded that the audience responded with visible shock, and that the general sentiment in the room was that George Boleyn would be acquitted. His defense had been, by all accounts, intelligent, composed, and devastating in its detail. He had addressed each charge in turn. He had exposed the thinness of what was being presented as evidence. He had, for a few hours in a room inside the Tower of London, made the Crown's case look like what it almost certainly was. He was convicted, anyway. The jury deliberated briefly. George Boleyn was approximately 31 or 32 years old. He had been his sister's closest ally, her companion in the evangelical circle that had shaped both their adult lives. He died on Tower Hill on May 17th, maintaining his innocence to the last. His scaffold speech acknowledged, as all Christian scaffold speeches did, that he had been a sinner, but he specified he was not confessing to the specific charges that had put him there. And then there was Mark Smeaton, the only one who had confessed. He died on the same morning, at the same location, and, critically, he did not fully retract his confession at the scaffold. He reportedly said something to the effect that he deserved to die. Historians have debated ever since what that statement actually means. The most uncharitable reading is that Smeaton was confirming his guilt at the final moment. The reading the evidentiary record most supports is this. Mark Smeaton was a young musician of low social rank who had spent time in a room with Thomas Cromwell's investigators and emerged from that room having given them what they needed. Whether the means was physical torture, the rack, or the compression device some accounts call the scavenger's daughter, or psychological pressure of a kind no 25-year-old of modest birth could realistically withstand, the record does not say with certainty. What the record does say is that Mark Smeaton was the only accused man whose social rank made physical torture legally available to the Crown under Tudor law. Gentlemen were technically protected from the rack. Mark Smeaton was not a gentleman. He was a musician, alone, young, with no family protection, no legal patron, no one whose intervention would have complicated Cromwell's mourning. He confessed. He was the only one who did. And the entire prosecution of a Queen of England rested, in terms of physical evidence, on that single document, obtained from that single man, under circumstances that no serious historian has ever been able to describe as clean. Here is something the history books mention, and then often move past too quickly. While the 5 men were dying on Tower Hill on the morning of May 17th, 1536, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was somewhere else, performing a different administrative function. He was annulling Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII. 2 days after her conviction for treasonously betraying her husband. 2 days before her scheduled execution as his queen. Cranmer declared the marriage null and void, invalid, as if it had never legally existed. The grounds for this annulment have never been fully explained in surviving records, which has generated its own small industry of historical argument. Some scholars have suggested it related to a supposed pre-contract between Anne and Henry Percy, that the earlier, frustrated romance of Anne's youth had created a legal impediment to her marriage with Henry. Others have suggested the grounds were constructed specifically to serve the Crown's legal needs, and that seeking a rational explanation is a mistake, because the annulment was not about rationality. What the annulment accomplished, in practical legal terms, was this. Anne Boleyn would walk to her execution 2 days later, as a woman who had been found guilty of treason against a marriage that had just been officially declared never to have existed. The charge said she had betrayed her husband. The annulment said she had never had a husband. Both documents carry the seal of the English crown. Both were real. The irony is so complete, it almost sounds invented. It was not invented. It is in the historical record. The execution had originally been scheduled for May 18th. It was postponed. The reason given, that additional witnesses needed to be sworn, is the administrative explanation that survives in the record. Historians have noted, with varying degrees of understatement, that the specific logistics of the postponement have the feeling of the left hand not knowing what the right hand was doing, that the machinery assembled to destroy Anne had moved so quickly that even the Tower's administrative apparatus had trouble keeping pace. Anne was told. She waited another day. What we know of Anne's state of mind during her imprisonment in the Tower comes primarily from the letters of Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, who reported her conversations to Cromwell in writing. Kingston was doing exactly what he had been asked to do, monitoring Anne, recording her words, forwarding anything potentially useful. He was her jailer. He was also, in these letters, her inadvertent chronicler. His letters describe a woman who oscillated between anguish and composure. She wept, she laughed. Sometimes, Kingston recorded, at strange moments, with what sounded more like the edge of hysteria than genuine humor. She asked about her daughter. She asked whether Elizabeth would be taken care of. She asked what would happen to her ladies. She asked, at one point, whether they intended to keep her in the Tower forever, not yet having received confirmation of the sentence. She already knew the sentence. Kingston's letters capture a woman who was not passive and was not broken. She was actively working, even in confinement, to manage whatever might come after. For Elizabeth, for the people around her, for the fragile question of how she would be remembered. That question, how would she be remembered, appears to have concerned her. She had constructed her public reputation with great care over a long career at a court that destroyed the carelessly public. She was not going to stop constructing it now. When the postponement came and went and the morning of May 19th arrived, she was prepared. There are approximately 1,000 days between the morning Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey and the morning of May 19th, 1536. 1,000 days. Let that number sit for a moment. On the morning of May 19th, Anne was led from the Queen's apartments in the Tower, the same apartments she had occupied before her coronation, across the short distance to Tower Green. The scaffold had been erected there, inside the Tower walls, not on Tower Hill, where the 5 men had died publicly 2 days before. This distinction was deliberate. Queens did not die before crowds. Even in the mechanics of her ending, Anne's rank was acknowledged. There were witnesses, not many, selected witnesses, officials, dignitaries, a small number of people whose presence was required to give the proceedings their official character. Estimates from contemporary accounts suggest somewhere around 1,000 people, possibly fewer, watched from within the Tower precinct. There was no roaring crowd, no public spectacle. This was an administrative event, conducted with care. Anne was accompanied by 4 ladies-in-waiting. The accounts of her composure that morning are consistent across multiple sources, including those written by people with no particular loyalty to her. Composure was not a quality her enemies were inclined to invent. She wore a dark gray gown, or possibly dark damask. The accounts describe something dark and dignified, appropriate. She had a crimson or red petticoat beneath it, depending on which transcription you follow. She had removed her jewels. She carried her composure like the last piece of armor she had left, which is precisely what it was. She had asked, in the days before, whether a skilled executioner had been arranged, whether it would be done cleanly. The answer, that a French swordsman had been specially brought from Calais, appeared to give her some relief. Contemporary accounts record that she made a small comment to her ladies about her neck being slender, which makes it easy for the swordsman. It is the kind of remark that could only come from a woman who had decided, completely, that she was going to control what could be controlled. Dark humor, in the most genuine possible sense of the phrase. Not for an audience, for herself. She spoke when she reached the scaffold. The speech is documented in multiple transcriptions. The version in Edward Hall's Chronicle, the version recorded by the French diplomat Lancelot de Carles, a third version preserved in other contemporary correspondence. The transcriptions vary in small details, but are consistent in their essential character. She did not confess to the charges, not a word of confession. She spoke of dying under the law. She asked those present to pray for the king. She described herself as prepared to die. She asked God's mercy for her soul. She spoke with the carefully calibrated language of a woman who understood that every word she said would be reported, transcribed, and judged by the living, and eventually by history. She did not say Henry was wrong to do this. She did not say she was innocent. Not in those direct words, not in the way that would have been understood as a direct accusation. She said she would not accuse any man of being the cause of her death. And she left that sentence in the air above Tower Green for everyone who heard it to interpret as they chose. Some historians have read this restraint as genuine Christian forgiveness, an act of spiritual grace from a woman who had accepted her fate. Others have read it as the most precise possible political calculation. Anne had a daughter. That daughter's survival, status, and future depended on not further enraging the man who had ordered her mother's death. A public accusation from the scaffold, naming Cromwell, calling the charges invented, denouncing the trial, would have cost Elizabeth something, maybe everything. Anne had spent 3 years fighting for Elizabeth's legitimacy. She was not going to endanger it with her last breath. We do not know which interpretation is correct. We may never know. That ambiguity, the silence in the speech, the things it carefully does not say, is one of the most eloquent documents the Tudor period produced. The French swordsman was standing to the side. He had arrived prepared. Executions by sword were uncommon in England. The traditional English instrument was the axe, wielded by a headsman, a method that historical accounts describe as, in many cases, requiring more than one blow. Henry had specified a sword. Whether this constituted mercy or aesthetics or some private emotional consideration, the record does not say. What the record says is that the arrangements were made. The man was fetched from Calais, and he was ready. Anne knelt. She had been told there was no block. She would kneel upright, not bend over a wooden surface in the manner of an axe execution. Her ladies removed her headdress. She tied her hair herself. It took one stroke. Every contemporary account agrees on this. One stroke. The French swordsman had been engaged specifically because this was his skill. A clean death, accomplished with precision. Henry had arranged this for Anne. At the end of 17 days, after everything that had been built and constructed and executed to reach this moment, he had arranged for her death to be as clean as possible. Make of that what you will. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was buried the same day in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula within the Tower of London. There was no coffin prepared in advance. Her body was reportedly placed in an arrow chest that happened to be available. The absence of a prepared coffin tells us something about the pace of the preceding days. Even the tower's burial arrangements had not quite kept up with the speed of what had been set in motion against her. Her burial place remained unmarked for centuries. Unmarked. A Queen of England, buried in an arrow chest with no marker in the floor of a chapel inside the prison where she had been held. The daughter she left behind was 2 years and 8 months old. On the morning of May 20th, 1536, the morning after Anne Boleyn was buried in an arrow chest under the floor of St. Peter at Vincula, Henry VIII was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. There it is. That is the third thing I asked you to hold on to at the beginning of this story. The idea that Anne was destroyed not despite her power, but because of it. Here is where that idea arrives at its full weight. The betrothal of a king was not an improvised event. It required witnesses. It required negotiation about Jane's position, her family's expectations, the terms of the proposed marriage. It required legal preparation. It required the prior resolution of the question of Henry's marital status, which Cranmer had resolved, conveniently on May 17th. the same morning the 5 men were dying on Tower Hill. Everything was ready. The arrangements that had to be made for a royal betrothal to be announced the morning of May 20th had to have been underway, in some form, at some level of planning and discussion, before Anne Boleyn was dead. The record does not tell us exactly how far before, but the calendar is unambiguous about the fact. 17 days from arrest to execution. 1 night between execution and engagement. 11 days from execution to marriage. I told you at the beginning of this story that those 17 days were the first thing to hold on to. We have now lived through every one of them. Here's what the record shows. Anne Boleyn was executed at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning on May 19th, 1536. The stroke took one blow. The French swordsman, specially hired from Calais, had done his work quickly. A small mercy that Henry VIII had apparently thought to arrange in advance, because he knew an axe sometimes required more than one attempt, and he had decided she deserved a cleaner end. Whether that decision was tenderness or simply tidiness, only he knew. By that same afternoon, Henry VIII was on a barge on the Thames. The barge was moving downriver toward a house roughly a mile from his own lodgings, where a young woman named Jane Seymour had been quietly waiting. He arrived. He went inside. At 9 o'clock the following morning, May 20th, 1536, 17 hours after Anne Boleyn's death, on the same day, her body was still being arranged for burial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower walls. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour were formally betrothed in the king's lodgings. 9 o'clock in the morning, 17 hours. Now, I want to be precise here because precision is everything in this chapter. A betrothal in Tudor England was not a casual announcement. It was a formal legal and ceremonial bond, binding enough that it required proper dissolution if broken, recognized as the first step of a marriage rather than merely the intention of one. You did not stage a formal betrothal on an impulse. You did not arrange the households, the witnesses, the location, and the legal protocol on 17 hours' notice. This had been planned. And not quietly planned in the way that a hopeful man might dream about a future, organized, scheduled, waiting for a specific event to occur before it could proceed. We know this because of one detail in the record that, once you read it, is very difficult to set aside. On the morning of Anne's trial, May 15th, 1536, 4 days before her execution, Henry VIII sent a message to Jane Seymour's household. The message, recorded in the dispatches of the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, told Jane's household to expect news from the king at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Specifically, news of what Chapuis's dispatch calls the condemnation of the putain. The French word, the one that means whore. Henry was not waiting to hear the verdict of his wife's trial before planning his next engagement. He was scheduling the announcement of the verdict so that the next phase of his life could proceed on time. The trial had not yet happened, the blade had not yet fallen, and the machinery of what came next was already running. Jane Seymour is one of the most difficult figures in this story to see clearly. Not because the record is sparse, though it is thinner than we would like, but because every account of her is filtered through a specific lens. Catholic factions at Henry's court praised her as a modest, obedient, appropriately docile woman who represented a return to traditional values after the dangerous boldness of Anne Boleyn. Protestant chroniclers, who tended to view Anne as a martyr to the reformist cause, depicted Jane as a creature of the conservative faction, a pawn pushed forward to displace a woman of genuine religious principle. Henry himself, after Jane died in October 1537, following the birth of his long-awaited son Edward, referred to her in his will as his true and loving wife, the only one he directed to be buried beside him at Windsor, which he was. Both of them lie there still. What we can say of Jane Seymour, based on the documented record, is this. She entered court service in the household of Catherine of Aragon. When Catherine died and Anne became queen, Jane remained at court. She was one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. She watched from extremely close proximity the full arc of Anne Boleyn's power. She watched the miscarriage. She watched Henry's mood shift. She was, by the winter of 1535 and into 1536, the focus of Henry's attention in a way that was becoming increasingly visible to everyone at court. What she understood about the situation she was in, she did not leave in writing. But she chose a motto, Anne Boleyn's motto, the one embroidered on her livery, stitched into her belongings, woven into the visual identity she had cultivated as queen, was la plus heureuse, the most happy. It was an announcement, a declaration that a woman who had fought for years for exactly this position had arrived at it. Jane Seymour's motto was bound to obey and serve, and if that contrast was accidental, it was the most eloquent accident in the Tudor record. Henry gave Jane a gold cup as a wedding gift, designed by the court painter Hans Holbein. The cup featured their entwined initials. It featured a love knot. And it featured Jane's motto, bound to obey and serve, appearing not once, but 3 times. 3 times. The man who had, for 6 years, signed his letters to Anne Boleyn as your loyal and most insured servant, had moved to a woman whose symbolic identity was her own willingness to serve him. The message in that progression is not subtle. It does not require annotation. Between the betrothal on the morning of May 20th and the wedding on May 30th, 10 days passed. During those 10 days, Jane Seymour was kept in seclusion at the house in Chelsea, where she had been staying. The reason for the delay was recorded plainly at the time. The speed of their relationship, it was said, sounded ill in the ears of his people. 10 extra days, as if the arithmetic of it, 17 days from arrest to execution, and then 9 hours to a barge ride and 17 hours to a formal betrothal, could be softened into respectability by waiting a week and a half before the actual wedding. As if those 10 days were the problem. During those same 10 days, Anne Boleyn's body lay in the Tower of London. There had been no proper coffin prepared for her execution, which was, in the record, a small but telling detail, because the ordinary preparations that would have preceded any expected death had apparently not been made. An arrow chest was found nearby, and her remains were placed in it. She was buried beneath the floor of the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula near the altar. No monument, no formal state funeral, no period of official mourning. Henry wore white on Ascension Day following her death. White was the royal mourning color. He wore it once and moved on. Meanwhile, at Chelsea, Jane Seymour waited in seclusion, shielded from the gossip and ill feeling that the visible speed of events had caused even in Tudor England, a society not exactly unfamiliar with the ruthless mechanics of royal politics. Even people who had seen the full brutality of Henry's court found the pace, this time, difficult to absorb. That tells you something. When a society that had watched Henry VIII separate England from Rome, dismantle monasteries, and execute his closest advisors, finds a particular sequence of events fast, the sequence is extraordinarily fast. On May 30th, 1536, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour were married. The ceremony took place in the Queen's Closet at Whitehall Palace. Let that location sit with you for a moment. Whitehall was not simply any royal palace. It was the palace that Henry had personally renovated and expanded during the years of his pursuit of Anne Boleyn. A project undertaken during the very period when he was desperate to give her a home worthy of the queen he intended to make her. Anne had lived there. Anne had been Queen of England within those walls. The tapestries, the galleries, the renovated apartments with their views of the Thames, all of it had been shaped, at least in part, in anticipation of her. And now, 11 days after her execution, Henry married someone else in the same building. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer officiated the ceremony. This was the same Cranmer who, on May 17th, 2 days before Anne's execution, had declared Henry's marriage to Anne legally void from its very beginning. Think about what that means in sequence. May 17th. Cranmer declares the marriage never legally existed. May 19th. Anne is executed for crimes committed within a marriage that has just been declared invalid. May 20th. Henry is betrothed to Jane Seymour. May 30th. Cranmer marries them. The same man who unmade one marriage performed the next one 11 days later. Cranmer was not a villain in this story. He was a deeply complicated figure, a genuine religious reformer who had agonized over his role in the events of May 1536, and who, the historical record suggests, believed Anne was innocent. He wept after annulling her marriage. He wrote Henry a personal letter the night of Anne's arrest that was the closest thing to an intercession anyone of standing dared to offer. And then he did what Henry needed him to do, both times. Because that is what power looks like when it is operating without meaningful restraint. It does not require villains. It requires people who understand the cost of saying no and choose each time to say yes instead. The wedding ceremony was small and private, but on June 2nd, Jane appeared publicly at Henry's side for the first time as queen. She took her place under the royal canopy in the presence chamber. She sat in the queen's chair. On June 4th, Whitsunday, she was officially proclaimed queen at Greenwich Palace. 16 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, there was a new Queen of England. Thomas Cromwell spent the weeks after Anne's execution at the height of his influence. He had engineered, or at minimum substantially enabled, the removal of one of the most powerful women in England. He had managed the investigation, managed the charges, managed the trial, managed the outcome, and managed the transition. His position with Henry had never been stronger. He was rewarded accordingly. In July 1536, Cromwell was made Lord Privy Seal and elevated to the peerage as Baron Cromwell of Oakham. The man who had begun his career as a blacksmith's son from Putney was now a peer of England. And yet, here is a thing about the kind of power Cromwell had accumulated. It depended entirely, at every moment, on a single variable: on the continued approval and confidence of one man. A man who had just demonstrated, to anyone paying close attention, that when he wanted someone removed, even someone he had once loved deeply enough to break his country's religion for, the machinery he had available was efficient, fast, and final. Cromwell had helped build that machinery. He had made it work. And in doing so, he had demonstrated its capabilities to a king who would eventually look at Cromwell himself and decide that the same machinery could be turned in a different direction. 4 years after Anne Boleyn's execution, in 1540, Thomas Cromwell was arrested on charges of treason and heresy. The charges were, by the assessment of most historians, substantially fabricated. He was executed on Tower Hill on July 28, 1540. He reportedly said, on the scaffold, that he died in the faith of the Catholic Church. There was no French swordsman arranged for him, no special mercy of a single stroke. The headsman took 3 blows. The machinery Cromwell had helped refine did not care who had built it. In June 1536, Parliament passed the Second Succession Act. The act did several things. It declared Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, illegitimate. It declared Anne's daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. It vested the succession in any children born to Henry and Jane Seymour. And in the absence of such children, it granted Henry the extraordinary power to name his own successor by letters patent or by will. Elizabeth, who had been born a princess in September 1533, was now officially Lady Elizabeth, not a princess, not in line for the throne, a bastard in the legal terminology of the Act. She was 2 years and 8 months old. She was at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, the royal nursery where she had spent most of her short life under the care of Lady Bryan. Anne Boleyn had not been a daily presence in Elizabeth's life. That was not how royal households worked in the 16th century, where royal children were raised in their own establishments with their own staff. But Anne had visited, had written letters, had sent gifts, had arranged, according to several accounts, for Elizabeth to be displayed to the court with the particular pride of a mother who understood that her daughter's existence was political as well as personal. Lady Bryan, writing to Cromwell shortly after Anne's execution, described the practical reality of Elizabeth's situation with a quiet desperation that is, in its plainness, more moving than any dramatic account could be. She wrote that she did not know how to order Elizabeth, what is meet for her now that her status had been so abruptly changed. She had no suitable household clothes for a child who was no longer officially a princess. She asked for guidance on how to address her. She asked, because suddenly nobody quite knew what to call this little girl, or what she was, or what she would become. The world had been reorganized overnight, and a child in a nursery at Hatfield was the last item on the list of things anyone was dealing with. I told you at the beginning of this story to hold on to 3 things. The first was 17 days. You have seen those 17 days now from every angle. The arrest, the tower, the trial, the 5 men, the scaffold, the barge, the betrothal at 9 in the morning, the wedding in the same palace, the new queen sitting under the canopy 16 days after the old one was put in the ground. The second was a 2-year-old girl in a nursery. We are not finished with her. She is the last thing this story has to say, and it will say it in chapter 7. But you need to know, right now, that Lady Bryan's letter about the household clothes is not a small detail. It is the smallest possible human view of an event that was enormous in its consequences. A child whose mother had been erased from the official record, whose status had been stripped, and whose future was now as uncertain as the king's next mood. The third, the one I said was the whole story, was this, that Anne Boleyn was not destroyed despite her power. She was destroyed because of it. Think about what the last few weeks have shown you. Catherine of Aragon had power, the power of dynastic legitimacy, the power of popular sympathy, the power of a nephew who controlled half of Europe. Catherine used that power to resist Henry for years, and Henry could not simply remove her because her power had external walls around it that his authority could not easily breach. Anne Boleyn's power was different. Anne's power lived inside the court, inside Henry's own household, inside the institutional structure that Henry himself controlled. She had influence over reformist clergy. She had allies among the nobility. She had the Queen's authority to shape appointments, patronage, and policy in ways that made her a genuine political force. Not just a consort, but a participant. And that is exactly what made her removable. Because power that exists inside a system can be dismantled by that system. You do not need to go to war against Catherine of Aragon. You need to outlast her, or wait for circumstances to change, or endure the political costs of defying her until she dies and releases you. But Anne Boleyn could be destroyed by the very machinery of the kingdom she had helped to build. A charge, a trial, a jury of men who were part of her own world and who understood, each one of them, without needing to be told, what verdict was expected. The same archbishop who had crowned her could annul her marriage. The same minister who had once worked alongside her could construct the case against her. The same king who had called himself her servant could sign the warrant. All of it was possible because all of it lived within the same walls. And Henry, who had pursued her for 6 years with letters full of longing, who had broken his country's religion for her, who had made her queen, Henry had simply decided, at some point in the winter and spring of 1536, that the walls were his, not theirs. His. She woke up before dawn. We know that. Multiple eyewitness accounts from that morning confirm that Anne Boleyn was already awake and dressed by the time the first gray light touched the Thames. She received communion. She prayed. She had already been told that the execution, originally scheduled for the day before, had been postponed, and the waiting, which anyone who has ever dreaded something unavoidable will understand in their bones, had to be endured a second time. She dressed carefully. The accounts differ on the exact gown. Some say dark gray damask, some say black. Nearly all agree there was a crimson kirtle underneath, a flash of red beneath the dark. Whether she chose that deliberately, whether she understood the visual statement it made, or whether it was simply what was available to her in the Tower wardrobe, history does not tell us. She walked out that morning knowing exactly what she was walking toward, and she walked steadily. That is the thing that stops you when you sit with it long enough. She was 34 or 35 years old. She had been Queen of England. She had a daughter she would never see again. And she walked to that scaffold, a low wooden platform on Tower Green, built specifically for this occasion, attended by an audience of selected witnesses rather than the thousands who gathered for public executions on Tower Hill. And she stood at the top of it and did something that no one in that crowd, possibly including herself, fully expected. She praised him. The words she spoke on May 19th, 1536, are documented. Edward Hall recorded them. Multiple correspondents copied them in letters sent to courts across Europe that same week. The words survived because the people who heard them could not quite believe what they were hearing, and so they wrote them down. She said, "I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never. And to me was he ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord." Read that again. Slowly, she stood at the top of her own scaffold. The man who had ordered her death had been engaged to another woman, officially, formally, in the presence of witnesses, since the day after her trial. And she called him gentle. She called him merciful. She asked the people watching to pray for him. Now, Some historians read this as strategy, the last calculation of a brilliant political mind, a woman who understood that her daughter's future depended on keeping the king's name unsullied, who chose, even in dying, to protect Elizabeth by making no accusation that could rebound on her child. Others read it as something more complicated. The grief of a woman who had, despite everything, loved him. The faith of a woman who had shaped her entire theology around the idea that God was sovereign over earthly kings. What I can tell you is this: she did not confess, not to adultery, not to incest, not to conspiracy, not to any of the 5 charges that had put her on that scaffold. She knelt. She tucked her hair under her cap herself. Her ladies, overcome, could not manage the task. She folded her gown around her feet. She repeated softly, "To Christ I commend my soul. Jesu, receive my soul," several times, until the French swordsman, specially brought from Calais because even this last detail had been arranged in advance, stepped forward. It took one stroke. There is a detail about that morning that history records almost as an afterthought. No coffin had been prepared for the Queen of England, arrested 17 days before, tried 15 days before, sentenced 14 days before. Nobody had arranged a coffin. Her ladies found an elm chest, an arrow chest, a storage box, and placed her body inside it. Her head was placed alongside her body, and she was carried the short distance to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls, and buried there under the stone floor. Not outside the tower, not in Westminster Abbey, where queens belong. Inside the tower, under the floor of the church where the tower's prisoners worshipped. The arrow chest, the unprepared ground. The inside of a building meant for captives. If you wanted a physical summary of how completely this removal had been arranged, down to its smallest practical detail, the arrow chest would do it. Now I want to lay the calendar on the table, because we are at the end of this story, and the numbers deserve to be seen together, all at once. January 7th, 1536. Catherine of Aragon dies. January 24th, 1536. Henry VIII is thrown from his horse, unconscious for 2 hours. January 29th, 1536. Anne Boleyn miscarries a male child. April 30th, 1536. Mark Smeaton was arrested and questioned. May 2nd, 1536. Anne Boleyn was arrested, taken to the Tower by barge. May 15th, 1536. Trial, verdict, guilty. Duration, under an hour. May 17th, 1536. George Boleyn, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton executed. 4 of the 5 deny every charge from the scaffold, from the most spiritually solemn ground a Christian in Tudor England could stand on. May 17th, 1536. The same day, Archbishop Cranmer declares the marriage between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn invalid, annulled, never legally existed. May 19th, 1536. Anne Boleyn executed, 8 o'clock in the morning. May 20th, 1536. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour formally betrothed. May 30th, 1536. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour got married. 17 days from arrest to execution. 11 days from execution to a new marriage. You have been holding the number 17 since the beginning of this story. Now you can put it down. Now you know what it meant. Henry got what he wanted. Jane Seymour was everything the conservative faction at court had maneuvered toward. Quiet, where Anne had been vocal. Obedient, where Anne had argued. She moved into the Queen's apartments, the same apartments Anne had occupied, with a speed that the court noticed, and that the historical record notes without editorial comment, because the record understood that editorial comment was unnecessary. And here is the part of this story that contains, if you are looking for it, something that a less disciplined narrator might call justice, but that I am going to call simply what happened next. On October 12, 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son, Edward. The son Henry had spent 25 years, 2 marriages, 1 reformation, and 1 execution trying to produce. 12 days after giving birth, Jane Seymour was dead. Henry VIII would marry 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, annulled within 6 months. The marriage was reportedly never consummated. Catherine Howard, a teenager accused of adultery and pre-contract, executed in 1542 on charges that historians find more credible than those leveled against Anne, though the procedural violence of it echoes with horrible familiarity. Catherine Parr, who survived him, barely, through the combination of extraordinary political intelligence and the plain good luck of Henry dying before he could change his mind about her. 6 wives, 2 executed, 1 dead in childbirth, 1 annulled, 1 escaped by widowhood, 1 outlived him. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the case against Anne Boleyn, the man who had built the machinery that turned court gossip and 1 disputed confession into 5 executions and a queen's death, was himself arrested in June 1540. He was charged with treason and heresy. He was executed on Tower Hill on July 28, 1540, 4 years after Anne Boleyn. He is buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. The same chapel, the same floor. I will leave that where it is and let you decide what to do with it. Henry V died on January 28, 1547. He had been King of England for 37 years. He had outlived Anne Boleyn by almost 11 years. By the time he died, Elizabeth Tudor was 13 years old. She had been 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was executed. She had been declared illegitimate shortly after Anne's death, stripped of her title of princess, reduced to the designation of Lady Elizabeth, her place in the succession effectively erased. She had grown up in a court where her mother's name was, at minimum, politically inconvenient, where the safest thing was to not say it, where survival required learning, early and completely, that some truths were better carried quietly than spoken aloud. The woman who would become Elizabeth the Fine learned that lesson so well that she spent 44 years on the throne of England, 44 years as the most powerful woman in Europe, and almost never, in all that time, mentioned her mother publicly. Almost never. There is a ring. It is small, mother of pearl, set in gold with rubies. It belonged to Elizabeth I. She was reportedly never without it. Her coronation ring and this ring, the 2 pieces of jewelry she wore to the end of her life. The ring opens. Inside its locket there are 2 portraits, painted in miniature enamel. One is Elizabeth herself, rendered in the style of the 1570s when she would have been in her early 40s. The other is a young woman in the fashion of the 1530s, wearing a French hood. Historians have debated who that second woman is. Some say it might be Catherine Parr, Elizabeth's stepmother, but the British Museum, examining the portrait, has noted that its features match most closely with another surviving depiction of Anne Boleyn, the famous portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, the one with the bee necklace. Historian Eric Ives, who spent his entire professional career studying Anne Boleyn's life and death, concluded the same. Elizabeth carried that ring. Every day, for decades, she never displayed it publicly. She never spoke of it. She never used it to make a political argument or a sentimental appeal. She simply wore it, closed, on her finger, where only she knew what was inside it. That ring is the only monument Anne Boleyn ever got from her daughter. A private picture, a closed locket, a silence that looked, from the outside, like forgetting. But that was, if the ring means what it appears to mean, the most permanent act of memory Elizabeth ever committed. Now I want to come back to three things. You have been holding them this whole time. The first, 17 days. What does 17 days tell you? It tells you that this was not a careful judicial process, overwhelmed by tragic momentum. It tells you that between the arrest of a Queen of England and her death, there was barely time to arrange a coffin, which, as we have established, they did not bother to do. 17 days from arrest to execution is not the pace of justice. It is the pace of necessity. The pace of a decision already made, being executed with the minimum required ceremony. The four men who denied the charges, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, George Boleyn, they died 2 days before Anne on that Tower Hill scaffold, insisting, before God, with their immortal souls staked on it, that they were innocent. Devout men, in a devout age, at the moment in their lives when a false confession would have been spiritually catastrophic, and a true confession would have meant no more to them in practical terms, since they were already dead either way. They chose to die unconfessed, rather than confirm a story they knew was not true. That is 17 days. The second, Anne was destroyed not despite her power, but because of it. She was the woman who had held a king suspended in longing for 6 years, who had changed England's relationship with Rome, who had been crowned at Westminster Abbey, who had produced a child that 3 generations of the most powerful women in Europe would eventually acknowledge as England's defining monarch. She was not a passive figure. She was not a victim in the simple sense. She was a woman who had wielded genuine power in a world that tolerated female power only on very specific conditions, and who had, by early 1536, become inconvenient in ways that power without institutional protection cannot survive. The moment Catherine of Aragon died, Anne lost the argument for her own necessity. The moment she miscarried a male child, she lost the argument for her own future. And the moment Henry turned his eyes to Jane Seymour, the machinery turned with him, because machinery, in the end, turns toward whoever controls it. The third, the 2-year-old girl, she grew up to rule England for 44 years. She defeated the Spanish Armada. She navigated the most treacherous political waters in Europe with a precision that made her contemporaries describe her as genuinely extraordinary. She never married. She made herself deliberately and completely unremovable through the mechanism that had removed her mother. She refused to give any king or council the leverage of a queen consort's position. Some historians have noted carefully that Elizabeth I's refusal to marry reads differently when you remember what happened to the last woman who trusted a Tudor king with that particular vulnerability. She built the England her mother's death had made possible, the Church of England. The institution Anne had helped create through her influence on Henry's break with Rome survived under Elizabeth when Mary I's Catholic reign had nearly extinguished it. The Protestant Reformation in England found its permanent footing in Elizabeth's reign. What Anne had pushed toward, Elizabeth completed. She did it without ever saying her mother's name out loud. And then, when Elizabeth was dying, January 1603, cold weather, Richmond Palace, old age finally outpacing the political intelligence she had deployed for half a century. The ring was on her finger, where it had always been. The locket with the two portraits inside, closed. Anne Boleyn was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in 1536, with no ceremony and no proper coffin. In 1876, during renovation works ordered by Queen Victoria, the chancel floor of that chapel was excavated. The remains were examined. The location of Anne Boleyn's burial was identified. A marble floor was installed with a marker. A formal grave, finally, 340 years late. Her daughter had been dead for 273 years by then. I want to tell you one last thing. The title of this story asked a question, not a legal question, not a procedural one, a moral one. Whether what happened to Anne Boleyn, carried out with the full formal apparatus of Tudor justice, the arrest, the charges, the jury, the verdict, the warrant, the French swordsman, whether all of that dressing constitutes something different, in moral terms, than what the word murder describes. I am not going to answer that for you. What I am going to do is leave you with the calendar. January 7th, January 29th, April 30th, May 2, May 15th, May 17, May 17, May 19, May 20th, May 30. The miscarriage, the arrest. The trial that lasted less than an hour. The executions of 4 men who denied everything, at the moment when denial cost them everything. The annulment was declared 2 days before the execution, so she would not die as a wife. The execution. The engagement was announced the next morning. The marriage 11 days later. And somewhere in a nursery at Hatfield, 22 miles from London, on the morning of May 19th, 1536, a little girl who was 2 years old. She did not know yet. She would carry the knowing for the rest of her life, inside a ring she never opened in public, in a silence she maintained for 44 years on the throne of the country her mother's destruction had helped to build. Elizabeth, I died on March 24th, 1603. She was 69 years old. The ring was on her finger. Draw your own conclusions. This has been The King Murdered His Queen, then married someone else 11 days later. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it stayed with you, if the calendar stayed with you, there is more history like this waiting. Subscribe, and I will bring it to you.